Um, Good evening, everyone. I'm expecting a very positive energy today, and I think we've had our dinner. Everybody is fresh and eager to hear this, our honorable asset. I call him asset because I think he's a treasure to the country, it's a treasure to every one of us here. So I need to have that feeling that we're looking forward to this evening. Good evening, everyone. Here you go, you see, we are alive, that's good. I think I'm sorry, usually I would like to give full respect to stand up, but I'm being mandated to sit and use this speaker. So if that's okay, I'm going to sit down to address the House with all apology. My name is Rakia Suleiman. I'm from Unison, and I'm part of the STUC Black Workers Committee. Today, I have the honor to sit down again with Professor Sir Geoff Palmer. I'm just going to just give a bit of what I think I know about Prof, and then from there he's going to take the stand and do what he do best, and I think what he's born to do. Sir Geoff Palmer is a professor in School of Life Science at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, Scotland, and a human rights activist. He discovered the Bailey aberration process while a researcher at Brewery Research Foundation from 1968 to 1977. In 1998, Palmer became the fourth person and the first European to be honored with American Society of Brewery Chemistry Award of Distinction. That also considered him to be a Nobel Prize of Brewing. In 1989, he became the first black professor in Scotland, becoming a professor of Emirates after he retired in 2005. He was knighted in 2014 New Year honor. Alongside his academic work, Geoff is also a prominent human rights activist, and he is involved in a considerable amount of charity work in the community. His book on race relation, entitled Mr. White, The Reverend, was first published in 2001. Geoff has also authored a book on the history of slavery, The Enlightenment Abolished, Citizen of Britishness in 2007, and has spoken out extensively against the slave trade. We are honored today that Sir Geoff Palmer is with us tonight to deliver the inaugural Jane Samuel Memorial Lecture. This is just a bit of what I know about him. I think for those of us who know Prof, we cannot take much out of him every time we see him. And anytime I see Prof, it's a father that I don't have. I have a dad, but my dad has somebody to compete with him. And I think it's a pleasure to be sitting with him. Thank you, sir. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oops.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Suleiman. Thank you. When I went to Africa some time ago, I was told that all the young ladies will be my cousin. And this is one of my, not just my cousins, one of my daughters.
Thank you, sir.
But anyway, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope I'll be able to fulfill all the expectations, in that yesterday morning I got up at what, 6 o'clock, took the train to Cirencester to give a talk this morning to the university in Cirencester. It's an agricultural university. So I gave a talk at what, about 11 o'clock this morning, and I got the train at 2 o'clock because I didn't want to miss this meeting tonight, and got here at 7:30. So I've been on the train for 2 days. And to me, that is an expression of when you think something is important, that even though you're 75, that in fact you do your best to try it. And I remember when I was in China, and I was invited by the Chinese government, and I was going to give a lecture somewhere in China, and a young lad came up to me, Chinese lad, and he told me he had read everything I'd written, and he was on the train for 3 days to get to the talk, and he's got to be on the train 3 days to get home again. So me taking 2 days is not much. Well, what I'll try and do tonight, there are so many things have happened, and that somehow tells us about ourselves, tells us about the society we're living in, and tells us about what we will have to do in order to help to change the way we live. That I can start, and I think I should start, with, in fact, the position of the migrants. And you may feel the same. I'm a migrant myself. I mean, I came to this country in 1955. And some people would have thought it was horrific for a 14-year-old child from Jamaica who'd not traveled any distance before to be put on a plane, on a boat, to get to this country on his own in 1955. But then my mother paid £86 to get me here, and it was quite comfortable. When I look at those people and those children, and children who look tired and hurt and damaged, and I say to myself, just like we look back at a situation like slavery 200 years ago and think, how could human beings have behaved in that way towards other human beings? I think in 100 years' time, people will look back at us and say, who are those people? How could they have allowed people and children to, in fact, put up and to live like that in 2050? So somehow we have a legacy, and that will be one of the legacies, that people will look up our names, look up where we live, look up this union, and say, how could they be talking about rights when, in fact, when they look at those pictures, because those pictures will be kept. So this is going to be part of our legacy. And somehow I feel uncomfortable, basically because I feel, well, what can I do? But that sounds very much like the people 200 years ago saying, what could they do? So somehow, I don't know what we can do, but I feel that whatever we can do, we should do it. Whether it's contributing, whether it's money, or whether it's writing a letter, or whether it's making some sort of comment, that I feel we have a responsibility to do that. The other aspect, and since it's only happened a couple of days ago, I was absolutely horrified when I heard the Prime Minister, he'll probably take his knighthood back, when I heard the Prime Minister in Jamaica on his first visit. And I'm not saying he's a bad person or anything of that sort. But what I'm saying is that when he actually said, you know, he was going to contribute 25 million, and I couldn't believe my ears, you know, to build a new prison in Jamaica. And I thought, and that this new prison will accommodate prisoners in the UK who are regarded as troublesome. Now, I have spent some time in the past visiting women prisoners, ethnic minority prisoners, mainly from the Caribbean, in Corton Vale. And I was asked by the prison service to go and to speak to some of the women prisoners there. And I can tell you that some of these women are very vulnerable. Some of them were used as drug mules. In fact, it was a form of abuse. And these young people, I met one young woman whom, in fact, was arrested somewhere in Birmingham, and her children didn't know she was in prison. Her friend was looking after her children for her. So somehow, to talk about prisoners in that sense, I just felt it was misguided. And somehow, the Herald rang me yesterday and asked me my views on this, because I think Sir Tom Devine has written a new book on slavery, and that is coming out, I think, tomorrow. And I was asked to comment not only on the book, but I was asked to comment on the statement made by our Prime Minister. And I just think the visit will be overshadowed by that statement. If you look at the Jamaica Gleaner and other newspapers, it has taken up the front pages of newspapers which should be actually celebrating the visit, rather than one about building a prison for a country. And that leads me into this. So you can see why it was so inappropriate, and so many other things could have been said. For example, if we just look at Jamaica as a whole, and we look at Glasgow, just as an example, I think you all know the Gallery of Modern Art, Goma. What do you think it is? It looks like an institution, like a bank, doesn't it? It was built in about the 1770s. The 1770s, that was built. The Gallery of Modern Art. It's a slave master's house. So the Gallery of Modern Art is a house. Even by today's standards, that would be outrageous. It was built in the 1770s, and it's William Cunningham's house. And his slave plantation was in Jamaica. And it was being managed by his friends, the Weatherburns, whom, in fact, their descendants is Lord Selkirk. So what we have is, that's a Jamaica contribution. If we look at another contribution, this is the country for which we're going to build a prison. And we're all responsible. He's our Prime Minister. In 1782, this was 4 years before Robert Burns bought his ticket to sail to Jamaica. So Scotland's greatest poet bought his ticket in 1786 to sail to Jamaica to become a slave master. In 1782, 4 years before that, the French in the Caribbean decided that they were going to take Jamaica from the British. 1782. All over this country, and even in the Caribbean, you'll notice there's a street called, there will be a street called Rodney Street. Okay? Rodney Street. There's one in Edinburgh. I don't know if there's one in Glasgow. But there's a Rodney Street just about in every British city, and also abroad. We had one in Jamaica. Who was Rodney? In 1782, Jamaica was providing Britain with more than 50% of its income from overseas territories. Jamaica was giving Britain more money than the American colonies. The French, in order to decide to unstable the British Empire, the piece of land they wanted wasn't London, it wasn't Virginia, it wasn't the other Caribbean islands, it was Jamaica. Because Jamaica was providing over 50% of the income. If they took Jamaica, the French, then they could take America back. Taking America wasn't a big deal. Jamaica was producing the income. In 1800, 1782 to 800, Jamaica had 300,000 slaves. The island, Jamaica, is 150 miles long. It's about 50 miles wide. It had 300,000 slaves, producing sugar, coffee, a lot of it coming to Port Glasgow. Now, the French was going to take it. Rodney was the admiral. He was told he had to go down to Jamaica in 1782, and he couldn't lose. Nelson could have lost at Trafalgar. It wouldn't make any difference. Rodney had to win in 1782, because if Jamaica was lost, we probably wouldn't be sitting in this room. That's how important it was. Rodney went down and he won. In fact, he was with another admiral called Hood, and we know Hood today of the ship, HMS Hood. The other admiral who was down with Rodney was Hood. And when they defeated the French in 1782 to save Jamaica, Hood actually wrote that when they went onto the French ships, so intense was the battle for Jamaica, he said the British sailors were walking on the French ship and they were ankle deep in blood. That's how ferocious it was. What I'm saying is that this is the same island that we're going to build a prison in. This is an island that contributed significantly beyond its size to the empire. The point is that that kind of lack of history doesn't help. Sorry. In fact, had the Prime Minister said what I've just said, and to say thank you very much for what Jamaica has contributed to us as part of the empire, it would have done a hell of a lot for not only for people in Jamaica, but it would have done a hell of a lot for the black kids in this country. Because what the black children and even people like myself, what you're lacking is a sense of identity, is a sense that you belong. And the fact is that Jamaica was part of the British setup since 1655. Scotland joined in 1707. So when I tell people that, they're absolutely astonished. Jamaica has been part of the British setup since 1655. And this is where I feel that education is so important, and we need it at all levels, because at a stroke, what could have been done is, if this history was related even in that form, and I could go on all night about the link between the Caribbean and this country, in terms of you walk around, you bump in it every day. And just to sort of conclude this part of the talk, because it's contemporary, I don't know, I think there's an Oswald Street in Glasgow? Yes. Right. Well, I'll say to you in the hall, who's Oswald? Does anybody know? Yes, they would know. But who was Oswald? And what has he got to do with us sitting in this room? Richard Oswald, in the 1760s, was a great friend of Lord Grant of Speyside. The Grants owned most of the land around Speyside. And when I wrote my little book, The Enlightenment, I had a phone call from an Adrian Grant, who was representing Lord Grant. And Adrian rang me in Pennycook, where I live. I don't know him. And he said, we've had a look at your little book, and you mention the Grants in here. And he said, well, what we are, Sir Archibald, the President Sir Archibald, is concerned about is that you mentioned the grants and you mentioned the sterlings of Kerr. Now, the sterlings of Kerr, when William Cunningham built that Gallery of Modern Art, he then sold it to the sterlings of Kerr, and it became the Sterling Library. Now, the sterlings of Kerr were also in Jamaica. In fact, Mr. Sterling said he had so many mixed-race children he'd lost count. Thus, a lot of the Jamaicans who are called Sterling can go and claim the Goma. Belongs to their great-great-great-grandfather. However, what Lord Grant, or Sir Archibald, the President Sir Archibald said to me, he said they were complaining that I mentioned the grants. And he said he would like to point out that the grants treated their slaves better than the sterlings of Kerr did theirs. And I said, I am sure the slaves appreciated it. So this history is not about where people say, as the Prime Minister says, we should move on. We don't move on from celebrating Trafalgar. We don't move on from celebrating all the other things we celebrate. So why should we move on for a history which is contemporary? We walk on it every day. It's just that it is not known. And I think if it is known, then we will, in terms of race relation, it's a new take on race relations. You can draw up enough policies and you can draw up whatever you want. I find with the general public, they have no effect. But I can tell you, I've lectured all over this country. I've got 20, 30 lectures to give this winter. And all the Scottish people from churches and from clubs, they want to know about this history because they say they don't know it. And they feel let down by their own education system, which has not told them it. And therefore, I feel that this kind of approach to race relations is much better. And we could do it for Trinidad, we could do it for India, we could do it for Pakistan, we could do it for, for China, we could do it for Hong Kong, we could do it for nearly all the countries which were part of the empire. Because people would then begin to understand why we're here and why we have a right to be here. And there is no excuses for it. However, this history, and this is my thesis, that we should, in fact, somehow, your organizations should promote our historical relationships with this country, saying we have a right to be here because our ancestors contributed on a pound-per-pound basis more than the local population. And we say, when I say we should all work together, and if I just go back to Richard Oswald of Oswald Street was friendly with the Grants of Speyside. They were both in Jamaica in the 1760s. Richard Oswald and Archibald Grant owned Barnes Island. Is anybody here from Sierra Leone? They will know Barnes Island. It's an island outside, just outside the coast of Sierra Leone. It was owned by Richard Oswald and Archibald Grant. What they did with Barnes Island, they actually used it as a supermarket. Probably one of the first supermarkets in the world to buy and sell slaves. In fact, while the ships were waiting to be loaded, they built a 2-hole golf course to keep the captains happy while the ships were being loaded. Richard Oswald and Grant made so much money that they were regarded as wealthy even at the time. But why Richard Oswald is important, and it shows you it is our responsibility to inform the community of even of their own history, because it's part of our history. That I drove to Auchencruth because I know Richard Oswald's house that he built is in Auchencruth in Ayrshire. And a friend of mine and I, we drove to Auchencruth and we found the house. It's a Robert Adam house, exquisite, elegant house. But what we noticed was in the grounds, the tower, which is part of the house, was in disrepair and it was falling down. And I wrote to the council, the Ayrshire Council, and I said it is falling down and it must be saved. It must be put back to the way it was, because this is part of our history. And give the Ayrshire Council their due, they wrote back and they said they know exactly what I'm talking about. They're going to develop the site, and the person who buys the site to develop houses must put that tower back to how it was. Now, somehow, here's somebody from Kingston, Jamaica, writing to the Ayrshire Council, because that's Richard Oswald's house. Now, why should it be saved? In 1782, after the Battle of All Saints, which Britain won, the New World had to be divided up again in 1783. In 1783, the British government selected Richard Oswald, the slave master, to do their negotiation. It was Richard Oswald of Oswald Street who decided how the New World was going to be. He went to the Paris Peace Conference in 1783, and he was negotiating with Benjamin Franklin and two potential American presidents in 1783. Richard Oswald agreed that America should be independent. He agreed or disagreed with the Americans because they wanted to keep Canada. Can you imagine? We're talking about Canada, not sort of, you know, a street down the road. Richard Oswald had the authority to give Canada to America. He decided to keep Canada in the empire. Can you imagine if he'd done that? Canada now would be part of the United States. He didn't. He kept Canada for the empire, and he gave the French Senegal. That's when Senegal became French. Richard Oswald gave the French Senegal. Oswald Street you walk on. He also gave the Spanish Florida. One man, ex-slave master from Ayrshire, had that power. Why? Because he was very rich, and because he was a slave master who made a fortune. And tomorrow you go into the cathedral and there's a stained glass window to Richard Oswald's family. It is still there because he refurbished the cathedral. Now that's why there's an Oswald Street. Now, if you read your Burns, Burns' probably most vitriolic poem. It's not about the English. It's about Mrs. Oswald of Auchencruth. The poem is called, and you should read it, it's called Ode Sacred to the Memory of Mrs. Oswald of Auchencruth. And if you read that, it's about Caribbean history. A lot of people have read it and think it's a Burns poem, it's a Burns song. It is not that. It's a vitriolic poem about Richard Oswald's wife. Ode Sacred to Mrs. Oswald of Auchencruth. It's about Richard Oswald of Oswald Street's wife. And Burns saw her coffin being taken to be buried. when he wrote this poem. And he says in the poem, this woman is on an annuity. This is 1789. This woman is on an annuity of £10,000 a year in 1789. The Gallery of Modern Art cost £10,000 to build. It is valueless, you know, meaning that you couldn't buy the Gallery of Modern Art. She was on an annuity of £10,000 a year. And he says he hopes she goes to perdition and never gets out. The point is that in 1789, a slave master who made his money in Jamaica could leave his wife £10,000 a year. £10,000 is like 10 million. Because Burns was going to Jamaica, his salary was £30 a year. She was on 10 grand. So if you want to know about Burns's feeling of aggression, just think of it. He would be about 19 when the Gallery of Art was built. You and I standing in front of it today would think it's an obscene building for a house. What did he think of it at 19? Standing in the middle of Glasgow looking at this building, knowing it's a slave master's house. And that's why he wanted to go. It's about making money. It's about changing your life. So, what I've done very quickly is linking what our Prime Minister said with a little bit of that history. Now, is it therefore appropriate to have said, I'm going to give you 25 million to build a prison? I'm not saying he can't say that. It's free speech. But when you consider the history that I've just said, and his first visit, I feel that if some of this history was repeated, and to say that we, the two countries, have a historical link which is very important and which we should try and develop. Like in the Herald tomorrow, what I said was that because of this history, I don't want an apology. A lot of people say, you know, Britain should apologize for slavery. What I said to, I think it's the comedian, what's her name, Smith? Elaine Smith. I had a debate with her once and she said, well, we should apologize. I said, you can't apologize to me, I'm your relative. Because a lot of Jamaicans are Scottish descent. So it wasn't just about making money. The Jamaica telephone book, 70% of the names are Scottish surnames. And if you look at the Jamaica genetics, how we look, we didn't come out of Africa looking like this. Whether we like it or not, we've got white genes in us. And they cannot be removed. It doesn't matter what we say, what they say, what I say. If, because of that history, we have these genes. And these genes are it's a testimony to that period. And therefore it must be respected because we can't make genes. So it must be respected. And it must be, in fact, dealt with the sort of respect which I think goes beyond the concept of we're going to make you a prison so that you can take your prisoners back. What I will therefore do is move on. But the concept which I'm trying to get across, we've got, I feel, I've been in the country since 1955. We've got to find different ways of getting across equality, different ways of getting across diversity. We've got to find different ways of getting across inequality. And I feel, and I think, I know it having spoken up and down this country, that when I speak about this history, it resonates more with the public than if I said the Race Relation Act was passed in 1976 and you've therefore got to recognize race as a right and you mustn't discriminate against me. It doesn't do anything, I don't think. And therefore, in fact, we've got to find other ways. This isn't the only way I'm saying. There are other ways, but I feel that this sense of the past, this sense of identity, this sense of cannot be separated because we are linked culturally, educationally. In Jamaica, I don't have a second language. My okay to Jamaica patois, which some politician says, all these Jamaicans are getting all these white kids to speak patois, and he can't understand any of them. The point is that I don't have a second language. My language is English. And therefore, my history is my language, whatever it was taken away from me. And I'm saying that English is my language, I'm proud of it, and therefore, in fact, it is part of this country's history. And therefore, it is part of who I am. And what I'm saying, therefore, when we leave this room and we walk down the road, nobody can tell us, because we're a little darker, that this isn't our country. We are here of right. And we don't have to waste a lot of time beating ourselves up, trying to say we have a right to be here. And because we have a right to be here, we have a right to, and I will say this, obey the law, we've got a right to contribute, but we've also been given the opportunity to contribute. And today when I was in Cirencester, I was talking about that right. How we can't contribute if you're not given a job. You can't contribute if you're qualified to do the job and you don't get it. And the point I was making, and I've made it before, is the interview system. And I'm telling you this because I've worked in industry and I've been on panels myself. The interview system is probably the most pernicious activity in terms of to carry out discrimination. Because taking an exam, they don't know who you are. You get the paper, you write it, and you pass or fail. When the trouble starts is when you've got to get a job, and I'm doing some work with Mrs. Sullivan with the NHS. The point is that you get your qualifications, you've got to get a job. The interview system, whether you're black or white, individuals there can make decisions. And decisions are not always fair. So prejudice operates at that level. In fact, I've given talks before and one person in the audience said, well, if there's a black person, a white person, and you know, I'm white middle class, and there are two people and I want somebody and they're both qualified exactly the same. Now, what do you expect me to do? And I said, you keep on interviewing until you get the best person. You don't just say, okay, you know, I'm middle class and you're not really middle class because you're black. So therefore I can't really take you. So somehow, and that person was genuine in terms of that was an issue that person had. And therefore these are some of the difficulties which in fact we have. I mean, I've had students, and these are white students, and one of my students was being interviewed. And I went into the room with him because I know that some of my students were struggling to understand the interview system. So I went in and I sat in the room. And the executive from the company said to the student, well, you want to work in the industry. What beers do you like? Now, this company only made lager. And the Scottish student, he said, well, to be quite honest, I prefer ales. And I held my head. Of course, he didn't get the job. And one of the things I put to people, now, that student, was he honest? Or was he sort of naive? He was honest. The thing is that you're absolutely correct. The point is that what we have is a situation where the person interviewing you is not there only to figure out whether you're honest. He's figuring to say, how tactful as well are you? The trouble is, from certain cultures, honesty is the answer. You ask a question, you give an answer. And you hope that the answer you give is going to be an honest one. The point is that if you go to certain school systems, what they teach you to do is to be tactful. And I'm sure that some students would have said, even though they don't like lager and didn't drink it, would say they did. So what you have is a dilemma. And it's pointless me giving a talk without pointing out to you that the system you live in, take away the historical context, take away the way the system is how do you relate with it when the system have values and norms which you either don't understand or don't subscribe to. And to me, this is very important, that somehow, and this is what I call, in my little wee book, I call it system consciousness. And I've talked about this concept of system consciousness in Brixton, or I talk about it in Morningside, or I talk about it in Bearsden or Glasgow or Edinburgh. And some people say it's a difficult concept because I'm saying system consciousness. What do I mean? What I mean by it is that whatever system you live in, whether it's in the colonies or here, there are certain norms, there are certain rules, there are certain attitudes, and I'm saying that maybe within the system we have to learn what these attitudes are. We don't have to subscribe to them, but I'm saying one should be aware, because it then gives you an understanding sometimes. If you understand why you've been rejected or why you've been accepted, then in fact you may be able to better cope with the situation you're in. Now, to me, you may also get through that interview system. You then have the other aspect of working to deal with, and that is leadership. Today, what I noticed, we had a guy talking about, he was talking about estate management, property, and he was talking about it as it applies to the whole world. This guy was an executive in a company that bought lands and property all over the world. And he put up a rather interesting chart. And that chart said the most honest activity in the world worldwide is agriculture. The most difficult and problematic is public services. A lot of us engage with the public services. So I looked at that today and I thought, God, you've got a problem. Because that is one of the most difficult sectors in the world. Because individuals seem to be less honest in that sector. Now, I don't know why, but these are facts. These are the way the world works. And you and I sitting here aren't going to change it. But for us to be aware of it, I think is important. That's part of education. It explains, if you're in a union, it explains what you've got to go for, what you've got to try and address. Because these are real issues. How you do it, I don't know. I'm not an expert in dealing with employment or promotion. But what I've noticed is getting a job is difficult, but also getting promoted to a leadership role is difficult. And one of the most important aspects, the chap said today, in terms of working, is to finally get a position of leadership. And what he says, leadership is the most important criteria for managing and changing the society. Now, how many of us are in those roles? How many of us think we will get to those roles, get to that kind of role? Because if our children are not going to get into those roles of leadership, then in fact we're not going to be in a position to alter and change the world as we would like it to be. Somebody will be changing it for us. And therefore, it's important, and it's easy for me, you know, I'm 75, so I won't be here long.
Oh, don't say that. Don't say that.
I'm being realistic. I'm talking about 100 years' time.
We'll clone you. We're going to clone you. We're going to clone you.
I'm talking about the little boy who I saw running under the table, under the chair.
Yeah.
Because that's what I look at. When I travel around, I look at the children. When I look at the television, I think my father got up when I was about 7 and decided he didn't want any more of this, and he disappeared. And he went off to New York. And my mother brought up, and her sisters, that's my aunt. So I was brought up by women. So I don't particularly get on with men.
Good for you.
I was brought up by 9 aunts. That's my mother's sisters. There were 9. There could have been 8 or 10. There were so many of them. And we all live in the same house in Kingston. And the house belonged to my grandaunt. And God knows who she was, because she never spoke to us. She walked around with her Bible under her arm, and it was her house, so she could do what she liked.
Yeah.
And my aunts and my mother, when my father left, she just took me across the park, because I can still remember it. When I was about 6 or 7, my mother took me in one hand and my brother in the other, and we carried all what we had. We carried it. And she took me to her sisters, left me at her sisters, and told her sisters she was going to England. So I was left with my aunts, and they brought me up. What I'm trying to get at, you don't need 2 parents. You don't need a lot of baggage to bring up a child and try to get it to do well. My mother left school at 11. So she could hardly read and write when she came here in 1948. In 1955, she sent her £86. And it took her from 48 to 1955 to save £86. And she sent that £86 to me, and it is her £86 you're benefiting from. When I came to London, she came to Paddington, and she grabbed me by my arm. I was 14. And she took me by my arm and she said, "Come, boy." I had not seen her since 48. So even when she died in 2003, and we often joked about it, I always say to her, "You're not my mother, you're too poor." And she says, "If you don't shut up, you'll give me my £86 back." So we had that sort of banter, and what I'm trying to get at, she is the reason why I'm here.
Because when I came to London, she went to work. She was working £5 a week. She didn't take a holiday. She got what you call holiday pay. That means you work your holiday. So she never took a holiday. She got 2 weeks pay, but she still worked. And she worked until she died in 2003. And what I think was lovely, there's the other side of her. She, when I got the professorship, I rang her in London, and I said, Mother, they've given me a chair. I was at the Heriot Ward. And she says, a chair? She says, a chair? What are they giving you a chair for? You have enough chair in the house. Tell them to give you money. So she, I'm not sure whether she knew what she was saying, but she was pretty shrewd.
She's right.
And there's the other story where she, you know, she came up to Edinburgh, and when I got a Doctor of Science, and you know, Doctor of Science, a pretty rare degree, and so she came up, and she went to the ceremony, and then she goes back to London, and I went back to London with her, and she lives in Haringey. So when she got back the next morning, her friend, Mrs. Pennycook, that's where I live, and it is spelled, the Jamaica Pennycook is P-E-N-N-Y-C-O-O-K, not P-E-N-I-C-U-I-K. And that's the old Scottish spelling, P-E-N-N-Y. And Mrs. Pennycook says to my mother, you know, they talk, she says, Miss Ivy, how is your son? Because I was in the house so I could hear, you know. Miss Ivy, how is your son? And my mother says to her, well, Miss Pennycook, I don't know, you know, but he's still at school.
She's studying. Oh, no.
So irrespective of who I was or who I am, it made no difference to her. Absolutely none whatsoever. And unfortunately, in 2003, when I got the OBE, and I rang her and I told her, and she was too ill to come to Buckingham Palace. And she says, well, you know, she said, Godfrey, when you go, dear, make sure you wear your vest. Your marina. That's what we call it. Because some of these people don't heat up their place.
Oh, gosh.
So, but she is the woman who fathered me. She looked after, she made sure the stability I had, and it's about the children. It's about how we behave. She had no future, we would think. The point is that her job was to make sure I was okay. And she worked, never took a day off. There was always stuff to eat. And it wasn't easy in London. I mean, what she had to put up with, God knows. The fact is that, say, in 1959, house prices started to go up in London. And the landlord, we had one room, still had the one room. And the landlord, and I just started work, and the landlord decided to put us out. So my brother, myself, and my mother, we've got this one room and the kitchen. The landlord decided to turn the kitchen into a bedroom. So we had to put a cooker on the landing. And then we had to go to court. And I had to do the defending. So I had to go to the library and read up all the law books. I was 18. And we had to go to the Angel Magistrate Court. So I knew all about unfurnished letting and furnished letting. And where you had your rights. I knew all that. And we won the case. And somehow, she put up with that. God knows how we did it. And I've never heard her complain. So your role as parents, what I'm trying to say, the kids need an identity, as I started off with that. So I'm really talking about children. We have a responsibility to do what we can. We may not have all the resources, but my mother did it with me, with no education, but with a commitment which I understood. And to me, that is also important. Children can see your resilience, what you're trying to do. And by identifying that, you can change their attitudes. You can't always do it by buying them a new computer. If they understand the difficulties you're having and the commitment you have towards them, then you can produce children whom, in fact, not only achieve something, but can look after themselves. To me, the important thing of a child is that you know that child will be able to look after itself. So the whole thesis tonight is that it's how we can develop ourselves. There are limitations to that, but sometimes we may have to be satisfied with that. But it shouldn't stop us from our commitment to your children or to somebody else's children, because my aunts looked after me. I wasn't their child, but they had a commitment to me. And what I try to do in my life is not only, I hope, not only to look after my children, but to do what I can to help other people to look after their children. Because I feel that the children, they are our future, and what I don't want is in 30 years' time, they're sitting here with the same feeling of disappointment, if some of us have that. I want them to feel that there's hope and that they're in a position of leadership where they are in a position to, instead of throwing stones at the machine, they're in the machine trying to change its direction, not only for the better for themselves, but for the country as a whole. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. I think at any time you give your stories, it's an opportunity for us to draw from it how we can make things better. And I'm just going to ask if any one of us have questions, because this is an opportunity for us. When I go to see Prof, I've got a book I have. As he's talking, I'm writing down. As he's saying stop, I'm putting things down, because in future, that's going to be something that a lot of people looking around to buy, but I already have it. So I think we should draw a lot from it today and take it back home and see how we can make a change. Like he's mentioned something very important. Leadership is the only opportunity we can have to make a change. If there's nothing we're going to take away today from here, let's start thinking about that. When you lead, you can make a change, and it's possible, and it's happening. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you.
Any question from the floor? We're going to take one or two questions, please. Okay, ladies first.
Thank you. I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment. I found it very challenging what you said about the interview process and about us having maybe to learn the language and the process in order to get ahead. But I wonder, should something be coming from the other side? Should there, is it realistic to expect changes from the system rather than us having to learn, the correct language to use, really?
Thank you. Professor, you're always very inspiring, and it's a obviously follow-up question the lady asked, and You talked about interviewing system, and there is a growing culture now, and a lot of organizations are going for unconscious bias training. Is they're building a shield? Are they trying to change? Or is helpful to promote equality in interviewing?
What do you mean by this unconscious?
Unconscious bias. This is a growing concept in the public sector, and they are putting people through this training. So panel cannot be unconscious. They cannot be biased. But the reality is, when you enter an interview room and you don't see a black person sitting in a panel, so you already get ethnic penalty to start with. So you will never score the full points.
Okay. I'll take another one.
I work in that big building quite near Minister of Defence. I'm a PCS member, and just to get your thoughts on independence for Scotland. What are your thoughts on that? I must admit, I find what you said today is very, very overwhelming and very, very so fantastic. To be honest with you, I'm overwhelmed, and I would love to see independent Scotland and see what your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I'll start off and work my way around. You're absolutely correct, is that when there's a change, who should change? Whether it's the system should change or whether it's the subject should change. The interesting thing is that, and that's why I said leadership. If you are not part of the system, then the system, you can't change it. We have to be realistic there. That if we're not in the machine, we are not going to change that system. But we've got to live, and I'm saying it's not about of compromising. You know, I can say we could fight the system, but if you have a child who's going in and want to get to university, and this includes university interviews. I've done a lot of work with BME children trying to go in to do medicine, and they have a psychological test for kids who want to go into the medical faculty. And that psychological test, when I look at it, it's Eurocentric. The point is that I was in a position to write to the principal of Edinburgh University, or I wrote to Dundee, and I wrote to the other universities, and I said, this particular test is biased. It was even biased against poor white people. It was sort of white middle class, this particular test. The problem is, how do we change that? And how do we then, can we coexist with it? So somehow, the system will be there, whether we like it or not. You will not be allowed to go through a red light. Because that's the way it is. And somehow we have to make up our minds that within a certain aspect of the system, and I would be lying to you if I say, okay, you know, just go in and you're going to get a panel full of black people who will be more amenable to you in terms of your needs. It isn't going to happen. If you're going to work for the NHS, or you're going to work for British Airways, you're going to work for the road construction, you're going to work for the Minister of Defence. The point is that I say that to them. If you want to know about equality, I say, don't ask me. Just look around your office. Because there are 4% of BME people in the country, and you haven't got even 0.1% of BME people in the management. So we are struggling there. And that's why I'm so hopeful for the next generation. That if we can produce an educated or a next generation who can look after themselves, one way or the other, then I feel we are going to change. It's not compromise as such, it's working smart. And to me, if we are intelligent enough, that should be okay, and we are. So that's what I would say to that. I'd be lying if I say, yes, the system is going to change tomorrow. It isn't. And the other question is, you know, we've tried that with the application forms. I'm on a lot of charities, and you know, the application form has no name, it has no address, it has no whatever, but you can tell from the schools. You know, you can tell from how many languages you speak. You know, those are still on the form. So the people interviewing have a bloody good idea. You know, do you speak Urdu, and do you speak this, and do you speak that? So somehow, no matter how they try to make it unconscious, it never is. And the idea, though, is that people are doing that because they are aware that we are aware of the prejudices and the discrimination which comes from the interview system. And somehow, we or you as a union, and I remember I said it in Brighton to your union, because they were debating whether they should call themselves black members of the union. And I said, what the hell are you doing? You're wasting time having a debate whether you should be called the black section. You know, I find it astonishing. I said, you've got enough to do. Instead of debating that. The point is that you as a union, you have the power of a voice. You have the power of an organization. You as individual, we as individual don't have that authority or power. So you could use your union as a voice, and the system is more likely to listen to a letter from this union rather than to a letter from you or me. So what I'm saying, if you want to change, you want to change that system, here's an opportunity. Your organization should be used. Make sure it is viable, fit, and powerful. Because if it is, then you can use it to start to effect change. If it is weak, vulnerable, and nobody listens to you, then you've lost an opportunity. So that's what I would say. The other point about independence. I think if you talk about, look at all the people in this room, we all come from independent Caribbean countries, or African countries, or Asian countries. So we were in your position as a colony. In many ways, the Scots see themselves as such. And I think that I'm for independence in terms of people managing their own affairs. The point is that you have then got to negotiate. I don't know how you do it. You vote for it. First, you've got to vote for it. You nearly got there. But the thing is that with democracy, if it's one vote, you've got a problem. And therefore, you've got to vote for it. And I'm not a dreamer. I'm saying if you want independence, it's got to be voted for. Because if it isn't voted for, people will say the people don't want it, even if it's one vote. But I think that if you vote for it, then go for it. So first you've got to get your people to vote, because all the people sitting in this room, a lot of us, are from independent countries. And independent countries can work. And I don't see why Scotland couldn't work as an independent country. But one of the things one has to watch, I don't know, I've never been in a country where two countries are independent and share the same border. I'm from a country where independence, we've got water around us, so we keep out the Trinidadians. And the Cubans. So we don't have a problem of border control. So somehow, these are some of the issues that you have to sort out. But no, I wouldn't stand in your way. Okay.
This lady here, I'm going to take the last question, please. Or two, okay. Is that right?
Thank you. You started to touch on theirs. First of all, can I say I really appreciated the talk tonight. There's been so much of value for me, and I just want to to say thank you for that. You were talking about leadership, and I just wanted to raise a question with you. Once people are in those positions of leadership, that becomes a very tricky issue as well, because there is the difficulty of remaining somebody who fits enough whilst you challenge internally. And the perceptions on the outside from people going, well, how come you're not doing this or that? Or because folk who are not in that position don't understand the tightrope, if I can put it that way. And I wondered if you had any comments about, I suppose, the lessons or that you've had that you would offer for people once they arrive in those leadership positions. Because I think that in a sense, you hold that out as somewhere to get to, but actually that's another hurdle once you're in. And I think it's maybe useful to say something, because I'm thinking about a couple of things. That the interview thing that people are talking about, systems are designed in ways that people are brought in. The kind of thing about you meet the criterion, but the one criterion that's always present and never talked about is, do you fit? Right, and that fit is actually part of, will you work with the system? The only additional comment I'm going to make is, if people want to watch this in practice, you watch what's happening to Jeremy Corbyn just now, because that's the question of, is he going to fit what they think a leader looks like? So,
We're sorry we could have taken more questions. Just that the staff.
Thank you for being here tonight. This is not a question as such. My mother's maiden name was Mackintosh. My grandmother's name was Mackintosh, but we believe that she was given that name. She was from St. Elizabeth, and as you know, in St. Elizabeth, there were two plantations, St. Elizabeth and St. Thomas, where you had many of the Maroons in St. Elizabeth and Codjo in St. Thomas. But what is bears for beggars for leaving me is with our Prime Minister going to Jamaica, and with the whole infrastructure and everything of the destructive force that the British have served upon Jamaica over centuries ago. Okay, that was then. But to go back, and with the infrastructure that hospitals are in a bad state, schools are in a bad way, roads are terrible, and to offer £25 million to build a prison is beyond beggars' belief.
Well, I'm from St. Elizabeth as well. In fact, my father, the Palmers, come from St. Elizabeth, so I know what the point you're making. And I quite agree with you that somehow, I don't know who advises him. Because to say that, especially to Jamaica, where we, and this is just historical, all other colonial countries are important, but Jamaica was put upon basically because it was ideal for growing sugar and coffee. And for what I say to some of my Scottish friends, like ministers of the church, historians, Tom